Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the Prime Minister apologised again yesterday for the treatment of the so-called Windrush generation after it emerged that some children of Caribbean migrants who settled in the UK from the late 1940s to the 1970s had been declared illegal immigrants and threatened with deportation. Last night, the former head of the Civil Service, Bob Kerslake, now a critic of many aspects of government policy and an advisor to the Labour Party, said that at the time some coalition ministers were unhappy with the immigration strategy under the then Home Secretary Theresa May.
I think it was not just a question of the Home Secretary being told it was a challenging policy. The Prime Minister was as well, and this was a very contested piece of legislation across government departments. Now, I can't say and shouldn't say, as the former head of the Civil Service, precisely who gave what advice to whom, but what I can tell you, it was highly contested. And there were some who saw it, I shan't name them, as almost reminiscent of Nazi Germany and the way it's working.
So that was Bob Kerslake. So does the Windrush episode undermine the government's immigration strategy overall? Well, we're joined now by Conservative MP Kwasi Kwarteng. Hello. Welcome to the programme. What do you say to what Bob Kerslake said, first of all, in terms of some people in Whitehall, implication maybe even some ministers, comparing aspects of that immigration policy to Nazi Germany?
I don't think that's a very helpful intervention. I don't think using the spectre of Nazi Germany, of Hitler or anything like that is remotely comparable to what the government is trying to do in pushing an immigration policy. And I don't think, as you pointed out, he was making a political comment. He's an advisor to the Labour Party. And I think he's just making political hay out of this. Right. I don't think it's particularly helpful to talk about the Third Reich or Nazis in this context.
Was it helpful to have a policy when Theresa May was Home Secretary that was sort of designed to create a hostile environment, to have vans being driven around for illegal immigrants, telling them to go home, which was dropped shortly afterwards? Is that the sort of policy that you're proud of?
I don't agree, actually, with the premise of your question. I don't think that the purpose of the policy was to have a hostile environment.
But Theresa May said that was the point of it.
I think what they were trying to do, I think we've always got to distinguish between legal immigration and illegal immigration.
Sure.
And forgive me, illegal immigration is against the law, and it's the government's job to enforce the law. So clearly, if there are tough measures, it's a difficult issue. But in terms of illegal immigration, the government has every right, in fact, it has a duty to make sure that illegal immigration is curtailed.
But do you accept that it's undermined the government's immigration strategy and policy overall?
Well, what I would say about this issue is that it's completely regrettable. The Prime Minister has apologised. Clearly, people who've come here before 1973 have a right to stay. So that's the important thing. And the other thing that we've done is that the Home Office now has a unit to try and encourage people, to try and help people find whatever documentation they need. Right. So it's not an ideal situation, but clearly we're trying to deal with it.
Right, and you've said there's been an apology. The problem is, Kwasi Kwarteng, is that there have been calls for the government to look at these issues for some time. And actually, we can now look at a 2014 impact assessment, which was around the time of the immigration bill, which actually noted within it warnings that said some non-UK born older people may have additional difficulties in providing original documentation. Some may have had their immigration records destroyed. There was already a recognition that others innocently could get caught up in this, and nothing was done about it.
Well, what's happened now is that we have got a new unit which is helping specifically the people you described. But you haven't
addressed that issue, that was already in the public domain in government in 2014.
The Prime Minister's apologised, the Home Secretary has apologised. We've accepted that we didn't get everything right on this.
Right. I mean, Billy Bragg, illegal immigration is, as Kwasi Kwarteng, against the law. And there were calls from various communities, including immigrant communities already here, agreeing with that policy to deal with any illegal immigration.
Yeah, but that, I mean, it goes beyond that. That Newsnight clip you showed us last night in that same programme, there was a report about a guy who retired to Jamaica who had a right to remain in his passport, and when he tried to come back to the country to visit his family, he was told his right to remain had expired. Now, surely, you know, does right to remain, is it something you get for life, or does it expire? Who in the Home Office is saying, OK, these people, they're not coming back, they're right, it's expired? That's, to me, making them into illegal immigrants. He didn't make himself an illegal immigrant. The government made him an illegal immigrant.
Right, but the government, if we take what Kwasi Kwarteng says at face value, has apologised genuinely. Now, many people may not accept and believe that, but broadly speaking, do you think there was support for a policy that was going to tackle illegal immigration, perhaps in a more hostile way, to use the Prime Minister's
Well, there
word?
definitely was, because when the 2014 immigration bill was before Parliament, Yvette Cooper spoke in favour of it, and Ed Miliband whipped the Labour Party to vote in favour of it. Only 18 MPs were brave enough to vote against. David Lammy was one, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn.
Do you think then, on that basis, that the Labour Party should have spoken out more in favour of immigration?
I think they should have spoken out in favour of a system that could define between people who've lived in this country all their lives, who were invited here initially by the government, and those people who've generally come to the country illegally.
Right. I mean, it is shameful, isn't it, for people who helped rebuild this country that they find themselves in this situation. And all the apologies in the world are not going to take back the stress and anxiety that they have felt, some of them on the verge of deportation and certainly a number of them detained.
Look, I think the deportation issue is a red herring. I think that there's a lot of
well, we had someone sitting here just a few
angst.
days ago, Andy Bryan, who said he was just about to get on the plane.
I haven't seen any evidence of people being deported from this country against their will. But your broad point about the upset and the anxiety, I think is true. And that's why you're absolutely right. I mean, we wouldn't apologise if we thought everything was fine. And you're quite right to say that an apology is not going to diffuse the situation entirely. But what we can do going forward, and what we are doing, is making sure that there is a unit and we are helping people find the documentation that they need or otherwise to affirm their status.
Should the government change its policy of bringing down net migration to tens of thousands, or change the immigration policy in any way?
Look, I think we've got to distinguish between what was a bureaucratic mix-up and what the broad policy is. Now, if you're saying to me, should we have an open-door policy and allow people to come in willy-nilly?
I'm not saying that. I'm just asking whether you would change your policy.
I would reject that. I think we have problems in terms of bureaucracy, and I think the point that you made, Billy, about the gentleman who was told that he was fine and then had a problem coming in, I think that's terrible. We've got to make sure that those things don't happen, or we minimise that. But I think in terms of policy, I think we've got it about right. I think we allow people to come into the country. I myself, I'm a son of immigrants. People come in willingly, and that will continue. But we've got to clamp down on illegal immigration. We've got to distinguish between legal migrants and people who come to the country illegally.
Just finally, I mean, there has been an implication that there's a racist element to this. What do you say?
I don't think that's the case. I think some politicians on either side have, over the years, exploited this sort of issue. A lot of people suggested that a lot of the UKIP vote was because of that. But I don't think in terms of the government or in terms of mainstream politicians that people are exploiting the race issue.
Thank you for coming in. Now, tomorrow marks the 50th anniversary of Enoch Powell's now infamous Rivers of Blood speech, given to an audience of Conservative Party activists in Birmingham. In it, he warned of civil unrest as a result of the Commonwealth immigration we've just been discussing. But ever since, he's been condemned by people across the political spectrum for the speech's racial prejudice. But what's the legacy of the Rivers of Blood with a generation who've known nothing other than a multicultural Britain? We sent our Lizzie and the poet Benjamin Zephaniah to a school in Wolverhampton to find out.
The speech had a lot of power because I didn't hear it, but I heard about it. And I can remember how the atmosphere changed in our house. We had to be careful about where we went. My parents were worried about us coming home.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
Benjamin Zephaniah was 10 when Enoch Powell gave the now infamous Rivers of Blood speech in the poet's home city of Birmingham.
The racism that people talked about behind closed doors was now spoken by, a politician, a respected politician, a man in a pinstripe suit, that we really had to be careful and be on our guard.
The Conservative MP for Wolverhampton was a member of the shadow cabinet. Angry at his party's decision to support the race relations bill, he told no one what he planned to say.
Hi. Thank you for having us. This is Benjamin.
But 50 years on, have his words lost their power to shock? We decided to play the speech in its entirety to a group of 17 and 18-year-olds at Highfield School in Wolverhampton.
At this moment, 20 to 30 additional immigrant children are arriving from overseas in Wolverhampton alone every week.
At times I was quite shocked at what I was hearing, but because of the language it was used, it was quite sophisticated, and I think maybe at the time, because of that sophistication, a lot of people believed in what he was saying.
For a man who worked in India and lived there and being this professor, you'd expect to have a much more open-minded view, but that doesn't obviously come from him.
Is it what you were expecting? Because it's really famous and you might have heard of it in the news and you might have seen little bits of it, heard it mentioned. Is it what you thought it was going to be?
Listening to it, I didn't expect it to be as like, when he said, like they said before, when he said with the black hand would have the whip over the white man, it almost sounds like he's, you know, scared of the future and scared of like people who have immigrated coming above the white people.
It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pile.
The way he says immigrant is almost quite dehumanising in the sense that he sees him as different. Personally, my granddad came here in 1961 and he, at the time, a young man, worked hard every single day of his life. It does really sort of like pain me in some ways because of the way that he was so convinced he was correct.
With racial tensions already high, when Enoch Powell was sacked, there were protests by those who felt he'd spoken for them.
But it has to be said, a lot of people from the white community came on the street and demonstrated against him. So that kind of gave us hope then. When I was a teenager, there were places in Birmingham and various other cities that we couldn't go to. There were no-go areas.
My parents experienced similar stuff to that. And they always tell me, they're always a bit sceptical of letting me to go places at certain times because they still have that mindset of there's going to be people out there that are out to get you, because that's the society they grew up in, after that speech especially.
Now, do any of you see issues, for example, with new immigration?
Usually it's quite like popular around like this area to say people are taking our jobs and stuff. You hear that quite regularly. I think everyone's like heard that at least like once, like they're taking our jobs, but in reality they're really like they're not.
I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing?
Imagine somebody saying that speech now.
You couldn't imagine even the most sort of far-right politician now saying some of the things that he said. That it's almost that they'd have to put it in a way that was much more tame to be accepted, especially by the media. But the same sort of underlying sentiment, I think, is still there.
2 generations on, immigration remains a divisive issue. But reflecting on the impact of Powell's speech, Benjamin's overriding conclusion is one of optimism.
We look at the struggle for racial equality and for justice, and sometimes we look at it and we think the odds are kind of stacked against us sometimes, because you hear mainstream politicians kind of speaking these ideas and making racist statements. But we just believed that in the end, good will overcome evil.
Reflections there from Benjamin Zephaniah talking to Lizzie. Well, we're joined now by Jennifer Paddock. She was a Conservative activist in the room when Enoch Powell delivered that speech. She's in our Norwich studio. Welcome to the programme, Jennifer. What do you remember about the day of the speech?
I remember that when I arrived at the hotel, the room we were to use was absolutely full of media people. And in fact, there were more media people than there were members. And I mean, mostly our meetings didn't attract a lot of attention, so I was actually really wondering what was going to happen.
Were you shocked by what you heard at the time?
Yes, but you have to understand that Enoch Powell had a very logical, emotionless way of speaking. So in actual fact, it's only afterwards that the full impact really hits you.
I mean, many people have said he was just a bigot who made dire predictions that were never borne out in reality. Did you think that after the speech, that this was a racist speech?
Yes, I thought it was a racist speech. He did explain that he'd had complaints from white constituents and black constituents because the black people didn't want any more immigrants to come in because they thought it would destabilise them. And the white people who complained were mainly elderly people who were very parochial and didn't like these people coming into their communities because they felt that they were alien.
And you said it took a little bit of time to sort of digest, if you like, the implications of the speech. Were you surprised at the reaction, bearing in mind it was full of media, the room you say at the time?
Yes, in actual fact I was very surprised when I saw the Sunday papers the next day. I really did wonder if I'd been at the same speech because,
really?
Yes, because it was extremely, well, very graphic and, you know, sort of very pointed. And I thought much more emphasis was put on it than actually was in the speech.
How do you think history should remember Enoch Powell?
Well, Enoch Powell did a lot of good things. I mean, he and Wedgwood Ben supported the abolition of the death penalty, the legalisation of homosexuality and several other things. And I really think it's a great pity that he has to be remembered for what I think was a mistake.
You think it was a mistake that he didn't deliberately design the speech to have the sort of impact that it had, and he knew that it did have a level of prejudice that was going to shock?
Yes, I don't really think that he had intended it to have the effect that it had.
Jennifer, thank you very much, but stay with us and listen to Billy Bragg's reaction. What do you think? It's interesting listening to Jennifer, who was there in the room at the time, and of course you have to go back to that time, and the reaction afterwards and how it has been talked about and discussed since.
Well, looking at the footage back there, I mean, his whole tone, you know, I hear the voices of execration. Never trust a politician who uses archaic language for effect. You know, I think that Powell knew what he was doing. That's why the room was full of media, more media. She said more media than actual Conservative members to come and hear him. He knew exactly what he was doing. I think he wanted to be the leader of the Conservative Party. I think he thought he could ride to that job on a tide of, he would call it racialism, I would call it racism, and he's been proved wrong. The way, and one of the very positive things I think of the whole Windrush children debacle is the way that the British people have gathered round the Windrush generation and said, no, these people are British. Because Powell says in the speech, if a West Indian is born in England, that doesn't make him an Englishman. Well, tell that to the Duke of Edinburgh. He was born in Greece. The point is, if we are to have a cohesive society, it has to be about place rather than race. It has to be about where you are rather than where your parents or grandparents are from. And the Windrush generation, I think, are a really good example of that.
All right. Jennifer, thank you very much for joining us today.
They should be in no doubt of their right to remain. This from the Home Secretary tonight, after a deal with Caribbean leaders over the Windrush fiasco and a promise, finally, of security to those who came here as children and have lived here ever since. After talks with the High Commissioners from Barbados, St Kitts and Nevis, Amber Rudd said the government was taking urgent action to help those affected get the documentation they need as soon as possible. But after years of insecurity and worry, is this enough? Labour tonight are hosting a public meeting in Westminster for people who've been affected. Fatima Banji is there. Fatima.
Well, John, Theresa May have apologised for this Windrush scandal. She may indeed be trying to make amends through this deal. But those amends do not go far enough for many of those who have gathered here in Parliament tonight. And I have to tell you, I don't think Parliament's seen anything quite like it. There are 3 committee rooms full of people who are either directly affected, or their family members are affected, or they are supporters of those who are affected. And they've been telling us their stories and of how they have found out that they didn't have the right to remain here in the UK. Now, in a moment, we're going to be hearing from several of the Labour politicians who are affected. But just to give you a bit of background, Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott, who has called this meeting tonight, has said that this whole affair has been shameful in its scant disregard for human decency. There's pressure on the Home Secretary Amber Rudd. Shadow Commons leader Valerie Vaz has said that she has left the Home Office rudderless. That's her pun, not mine. So pressure indeed on the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister herself. But first, let's just bring you a bit of background on the deal that has been agreed. And we have also been speaking to one man who says he was left unable to work for 2 years. Here's our senior Home Affairs correspondent, Simon Israel.
Hi Michael.
Hey, nice to meet you again after all this time.
So I've got some brilliant news for you.
Oh wow, oh my goodness. Oh.
Acceptance at last. Michael Braithwaite, aged 66, a Windrush child from the 60s, has come to pick up his biometric card. Not a passport, but a licence to live and work again. It's taken 2 years.
Brilliant.
2 years that's seen him out of work since reapplying for his teaching post in London.
I still feel angry inside at the way it has turned out, because you know I was becoming a forgotten person, and there's a lot like me out there that probably didn't have the opportunity to voice their story, you know, to the media, and I feel privileged, but I still feel hurt. You know, the pain is not going to go away with a sorry.
His case may have been settled, but the Joint Council for Welfare of Immigrants have many more which are far from resolution. 232 cases have already been reported to the Home Office helpline. The Windrush fiasco was top of the agenda in a meeting today between the Home Secretary Amber Rudd and some of the Caribbean High Commissioners. Last week, all 12 demanded urgent action. Today they got what they wanted, a British government commitment to put things right.
She sat down and gave us the assurances that she understands the situation and that the Home Office has given it priority, and they are moving with urgency and compassion to resolve the crisis that the Windrush generation has been confronting recently.
That includes a pledge to stop deportations.
I think the public will have the reassurance that if they go into the Home Office, they're not going to be rounded up and placed in detention. So I think people will now feel, okay, I have a legitimate case, I can come to the Home Office, and there will be a dedicated team which is committed to helping me, and not people who see me as an illegal immigrant.
For 2 years, the state treated Gladstone Wilson as an illegal immigrant. He was 12 when he arrived from Jamaica in 1968. He never left the UK, worked most of his life. 3 years ago, he lost his security guard job at the main hospital in Wolverhampton. A letter from the Home Office arrived saying he had no right to work.
I think I'd been treated dreadfully, really bad, you know, and with no respect at all. You know, I've been more or less treated like a criminal, because they had me reporting, as I say, to Solihull Immigration every first Monday in the month, and they made threats. They said, if you don't do it, you'll be fined £5,000 and 6 months in jail, or both, at the time. And I was so angry and annoyed.
He finally got his biometric card and has been promised his job back. But he has no idea how to access the government's offer of compensation.
I hope that a lot of other people won't have to go through what I've been through. Because it's like going to hell and back, you know, and I've really suffered badly when I didn't need to have to suffer like that. And the Home Office made me suffer badly.
The Windrush crisis has scarred this year's Commonwealth Summit, extracted an unprecedented apology from Theresa May, and has left the Home Office with a major headache over the future of immigration policy.
And we asked the Home Office for a response to Gladstone Wilson's case. They've told us he has now been granted a no-limit time agreement, and he's entitled to work, and he's now already been told. Joining us now is the Labour MP David Lammy, who's written to the Prime Minister demanding an independent review into the government's immigration policy. David Lammy, since your remarkable speech in the House of Commons the other day, you have become a kind of focal point for many of the people who are living in insecurity about all this. Do you have any sense of the scale of what we're talking about? Do you know any numbers?
I can't tell you what the numbers are. It feels like thousands. You know, people are coming out the woodwork. Many people had gone underground because they feared deportation. So, and these people are often very poor. So it feels like a number of people, and we're also getting emails, of course, from the Caribbean, from people who have been deported.
And do you have any undertaking from any of these people who've been attending the Commonwealth Conference that those people will be assisted by those islands to come back if they wish to?
Absolutely. The High Commissioners are very, very clear that they want to support people who have found themselves taken back to the Caribbean after 40, 50 years. And I think that's part of the discussions they've been having with Theresa May and with Amber Rudd, absolutely, from the emails and the phone calls that they send to me.
Now, verbally, and certainly what we've read, as it were, in the Home Office releases, you seem to have got everything you wanted, which is a promise of compensation, promise to bring these people back, promise to make up for what's happened and all the rest of it. Does it mean anything?
Actually, John, I haven't got what I want. The first thing is the evidence that the Home Office is still asking for. I believe that the burden now should be on the Home Office, particularly because we know that landing cards were destroyed, and people are saying that they're ringing up and they're still having to find evidence back to the 60s and 70s. Many of your viewers will not have pay slips, will not be able to get in touch with primary schools that they went to in the 1960s and can expect to have those records. So the evidence is the first thing. The second thing is the detail about the compensation. People have forked out a lot of money for lawyers. People have lost their jobs. People have not had access to health care. That's going to take quite a lot of compensation and reparation, and we've heard no detail at all from the Home Office. And yes, we've had the blanket apology, but I believe each individual caught up in this deserves an apology alongside a commitment now to review this hostile environment that has led us to this very dark place.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to pick you up, because the Home Office is going to have to change gear from hostile environment to embracing, caring, interested party in trying to make up for what's happened. Now, one would think there might have to be some sort of change of personnel to bring in people who perhaps understand the Caribbean crisis rather better than they have heretofore.
I've been a Member of Parliament now for 18 years, and I've seen over the years, certainly when Labour were in power, Home Secretaries go, immigration ministers go, and they went when there was a sense that they'd lost control of their officials or something they said wasn't right, correct, and they fell on their sword and a new person came in to run things. We do need our civil servants and our ministries to have a sense of compassion. Of course we must police our borders. Of course we need an immigration policy. But do we need to send a message that Britain is cruel, is inhumane and is hostile to vulnerable people? Is that really the message that we want to ring out to the world? This Commonwealth has begun with an embarrassing moment about really what Britain is about in 2018. And for all of those reasons, we need a review, and we do need new personnel.
David Lammy, thank you very much indeed for joining us from the House of Commons.
Now, Labour's public meeting with people affected by Windrush has been going on while we've been on air. Back now to Fatima, who's in the House of Commons. Fatima.
Matt, extraordinary scenes here in Parliament. 3 committee rooms full of people who say they are directly affected by this as the generation, the Windrush generation, all supporters of them. One woman I spoke to said that she had been in the army and yet she herself later received a letter saying that she did not have the right to remain here. So a lot of confusion, a lot of disbelief, and people desperately seeking help. And I'm joined now by one person who is directly affected, Winston Robinson. You came here at the age of 9 from Jamaica.
I was 9 years old when I came to this country.
Can you just tell me what happened to you?
Well, around 2016, my employers came to me saying that I'm showing foreign documents and I need to prove my right to work and live in this country. And at first I thought, well, I've been here since I was 9 years old. I didn't think that I still need to prove that. So.
And when you say your employers, you were an ambulance driver?
Yeah, I'm an ambulance driver.
And you are no longer an ambulance driver?
No.
You've been unable to work?
I'm unable to work for the last 2 weeks.
Can you just explain why that happened?
I can't. That's the question.
No.
I can't.
You're seeking those answers from the Home Office.
I'm totally puzzled by the whole thing.
Yeah.
And eventually I said to myself, you know what? I started to manage how I could, because I said to myself, somewhere along the line, when something don't make sense, there's got to be some kind of answer. So I knew it was going to blow up.
So you kept getting letters from the Home Office?
Yes.
And what did you do?
Well, I tried to return and talk back to them, but then I just kept coming to brick walls, refusals, and I think to myself, well, I came here with my younger sister. She came on my passport, and if she's got a right to stay, surely I should follow. That's what I thought, but it wasn't appearing so. So the whole thing just became a nightmare.
And you had a driving licence, you had a national insurance number?
Since I was 16.
No reason to doubt?
Yeah, I took, maybe I started to doubt myself because I said maybe you took a lot of things for granted and you know, this is the result for taking things for granted. But then I'm still saying, there should be some record of me landing here.
And you thought that you were the only person this was happening to?
Yes, until when I got into it now and I started to communicate on the internet, I started to see that this is, and it's like, it's funny, it's just affecting West Indians.
Yeah.
As I thought, I said there's something wrong. And I remember saying I remember my family, there's something wrong here, and I know it's going to blow up. Because then I said to myself, I'm not spending any more money.
So what do you make of the government's handling of this situation? Do you think the apology's enough?
No.
What would you like?
I mean, for starters, I can only speak for myself. She needs to give me my life back. In whatever way that's going to...
Who's she, the Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister, the government needs to give me my life back. Because basically, for 2 years, you took away my life. I was actually in a job which I probably would be still in today, right? And that's just all snatched away from me without any proper explanation about finding reasons why I should be here. I mean, it was almost impossible.
Just very quickly, can I just ask you, why do you think you were named Winston?
I don't know, I think my mum liked Churchill.
She liked Churchill?
I think the West Indians, my mum's generation...
That very British icon.
They've got these very British...
And how ironic that you should end up in this situation now.
Yeah.
Winston Robinson, thank you so much for joining us. So there you have it, just one person who says that they are directly affected by this situation. There are many more upstairs, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more from them.
Thanks, Fatima. Now, as politicians argue whether landing cards were destroyed and whether a hostile environment to immigrants was created, the question mark over people's Britishness is affecting Caribbean communities across the country, like Leeds, where there's a sizable West Indian population and where almost everyone has a Windrush connection. Jane Death reports on the impact the scandal is having on that city.
Chapeltown, the heart of the Caribbean community in Leeds. From the Windrush generation down the decades, families from countries like Jamaica have put down roots and been part of the city's culture, including Carnival.
It takes place in Potter Newton Park, which echoes to the music of the steel bands.
On Chapeltown Road today, it hurts that some people's parents and grandparents who had been celebrated for helping make this country are now being asked to justify their lives here.
Seeing as from the Caribbean, you're not from here now, and you're not from, even though you've helped to build the actual country, and as I say, it's not anything more than really disappointing that you're being perceived a certain way as not from somewhere just because of the colour of your skin, which is not the way it should be.
I don't know the reason why, because I mean, some people migrated in this country recently. For the past few years, they're becoming a British. So how can a person that lived there for all his life not become? There must be a concern, and I don't know what's the concern.
Theresa May might have promised no one will be deported, but the fear's been sown. Marcia Linton's mum, who came over from Jamaica half a century ago, now has dementia and keeps asking if she's going to be made to leave.
When she listened to it on the news, she started panicking, and she was saying, "But are they going to send me back?" And I'm saying to her, "No, Mum, they're not going to send you back." So I had to get her passport out to show her passport to let her see that she has got a British passport. I mean, what, in 5 years, in 10 years' time, are we then going to be told that we're not British because our parents from the West Indies, from the Caribbean? Is it going to come back up again?
Is it going to come back to haunt you?
Yes, yeah. So that is a worry as well.
The past has come back to haunt this little boy who moved here in the 60s.
The Home Office said they couldn't find me on their list, regardless to whatever I gave them, my national insurance, my doctor certificates, everything I had.
It feels to Joseph Bravo like he doesn't exist.
It's gone.
He was refused a passport, which meant he couldn't walk his daughter down the aisle in Australia.
I was going to miss my daughter's wedding, but what can I do? I couldn't do nothing. I just had to accept it.
If his welcome to Britain 50-odd years ago was recorded, the documents don't seem to exist now.
Who has put this thing into motion, right? Imagine today they're saying they shredded all this information. With all the digital system now, you're trying to tell me they couldn't have put all that on a computer? Yeah? It's just laziness. And so who's authorised that? Who's told them to do that, knowing that people are going to suffer?
Khadija Ibrahim's parents migrated from Jamaica. She's written a show about the Windrush generation and the stories of those who made the crossing from the Caribbean to Leeds. What's it like staging a tribute to them when some have found their Britishness being questioned?
Unfortunately, it's quite a sad time as well. So as much as it being a celebration, it's also a time of sadness and worry for many people who are very unsure about their position here after 40, 50 years or even 60 years. So a sense of security is really needed from the government, and in the climate that we're living in, especially within the climate of Brexit, where there is a lot of unsettlement feeling amongst communities, this has only added to it as far as many people are concerned.
Theresa May has said the Windrush generation is British and she doesn't want anyone to feel unwelcome. But that is how some here are feeling. They're hurt, and it won't be easy to mend that.
And the Home Office have told us tonight that they don't want anyone to feel unwelcome or in any doubt about their right to remain in this country, and said they've now set up a dedicated team and website to help people get the documentation they need. And Michael Crick is with me now. Michael, we can see pictures of the Commonwealth leaders arriving for their banquet in the palace with the Queen. Will they be talking about Windrush over dinner?
I very much doubt it. Perhaps the Caribbean leaders, but I suspect Theresa May will find it a bit of a refuge tonight. I was struck even by seeing the Caribbean leaders on Tuesday coming out of Downing Street, how sympathetic they were actually to Theresa May's plight. And there's this sort of, I always think, the World Leaders Club, where world leaders are sort of sympathetic with the problems and dilemmas and cock-ups of government. But once, of course, she's back in number 10, Theresa May has the problems to face. And then tonight, Labour have come up with an extraordinary clip of Mrs May on Question Time in 2004, when Labour was in the middle of an immigration crisis and there were calls on the Labour Immigration Minister Beverly Hughes to resign. And Theresa May said the Home Office was in chaos and said that instead of blaming her officials, Beverly Hughes should resign. She said, "I do think it's extraordinary a minister isn't willing to step up to the plate and take responsibility." Well, actually what happened there is in the end Beverly Hughes did resign.
And just briefly, I mean, Chogam, Brexit, the debate on immigration and Windrush, it's a perfect or rather imperfect storm, isn't it?
Well, it illustrates, I think, the problem at the heart of government. On the one hand, many of the people who voted for Brexit, not all of them, many of them want immigration to be curbed and to come down. On the other hand, the ministers are talking about a global Britain that will involve trade deals with people like India. The first thing the Indians are going to want is more visas for Indians to come and work here and live here.
Michael Crick, thank you very much indeed.
So let's talk more about some of those stories. Matt Kelly, Claire Fox are here, starting with The Guardian, which picks up again the case of one of the many Windrush immigrants.
I mean, I think this story is very powerful because as Windrush and the scandal about it has developed, I think that we've all heard the personal stories of many British citizens and the way that they've been treated. So I say British citizens because I think that's quite an important thing, is what you realise is you British citizens, your mates, your neighbours, the people we all work with and all the rest of it, are being treated as though they're not citizens. And they're being treated as though they're trying to pretend that they're citizens. And the whole thing about, you know, if you want the kind of important positive aspect of immigration, is when people want to be a citizen of a country, in preference to just moving in and kind of... But actually, this generation and their children moved here very much wanting to be British and then are being treated as though they're sort of alien, and that's why they're so shocked. So this terrible story of this man Albert Thompson,
Yeah.
with cancer, and suddenly he's told he can't get treatment.
Denied treatment.
As though he's kind of like sneaked in to try and kind of steal from the NHS. A British citizen. It's a disgrace.
I mean, it is literally inhumane, and he's not alone. I think there's 263 cases now been referred to this hotline that the governments have set up, but much belatedly in response to this scandal. And I was reading also in The Guardian, who have been very, very good on this story, about another guy, Dexter Bristol, who died in tragic circumstances, having been told when he moved jobs that he was undocumented, that he didn't have the right, that he was being reported to the Home Office, sent into a spiral of bad health. This guy who goes under the name of Albert Thompson, you know, disgraceful that we would refuse people treatment for cancer in this country, in any circumstance, I think. But the idea that young kids have come into Britain, as Claire says, entirely at our behest, and 40, 50 years later are told, you're out. Amber Rudd, when she apologised to David Lammy's brilliant speech, which I'm sure most people have seen, about this inhumanity, said, put the blame on the Home Office and said, they've lost sight of the individuals. And at the time I thought, OK, that's a candid and honest thing to say. But as these cases emerge, I start to get more and more of the opinion that this must have been known about at a high level, this procession of people complaining and being filled with anxiety about their future in Britain. And the tenor of behaviour in the civil service is not the result of individual behaviours, but it's set by policy. And the person who set the policy was Theresa May.
Yes, and the hostile environment policy, which David Lammy, as you said, spoke so clearly about in the Commons. I spoke to a woman earlier this evening who today had been given indefinite leave to remain and was absolutely delighted about it, having tried to get to the Caribbean, to Dominica, to see the grandmother, you know.
It was a great report.
But she said she came in 1961 as a baby, but she was almost rejected in 1998, well before the 2010 policy that the Tories put in place, or the coalition government put in place. So where does the blame lie? Has this actually been going on for decades under the radar?
I think that we should bear in mind that the immigration policies in this country have been something of an inhumane debacle for many years. Often people have been, when they've been deported, they've been dragged out of their beds, you know, put on planes in the middle of the night, all sorts of things. Over the years that I was involved in anti-racist politics, and both parties, let me tell you, Labour Party's immigration record is disgraceful and inhumane. But I think that that's where we get confused, and maybe we can kind of look at the next article, which is... Because I think that what's happened is you've got that side of things. Then what's happened is that there's been a contemporary modern discussion about the problems of immigration that's got muddled up with this prior issue, which was just that we had an immigration policy, sometimes the way people were treated was disgraceful and so on and so forth. And then you've had freedom of movement and the EU, and it's been then misread, in my opinion. And there's a brilliant article here by Fraser Nelson from The Spectator in The Sun. We've got The Guardian, The Sun, The Spectator all agreeing here, basically explaining that one of the reasons why this contemporary crisis has come about is because it's a misreading of what the British people believe in relation to immigration. So he says, you know, people want control of their borders. That doesn't make them anti-immigrant. He actually says that, if anything, Britain has got a fine, you know, record of welcoming people. One doesn't want to pretend that, you know, Enoch Powell and his types didn't exist, because that would be ridiculous. But he says it's a misreading not only of the referendum result, but of public opinion today. Seeking to control immigration is not the same as being anti-immigrant. And now that that control is assured, because we're leaving the EU, the support for immigration has risen sharply in the polls. And I think that's actually true.
You say that, though, but as part of the Brexit campaign, we all remember the pictures being used of the Syrian migration crisis across Europe and being held up in Hungary and trying to get through to Austria or wherever. Those were used as part of the propaganda.
Nigel Farage and UKIP and some people played a particularly vile game there.
But
they did not win.
You've hit the nail on the head there.
They didn't win the vote.
Farage, 4 million voters for UKIP. The Tories see that and see it bleeding away from their constituencies, And the response, this is the misreading, the response was, right, let's get onto their agenda. And when David Lammy said that the right-wing rhetoric has infected our political thinking, that's what he was talking about.
So chasing of the UKIP votes by the Tory party, you believe...
When he said, you lie down with dogs, you get fleas, that is what he was
And what's
talking
also
about.
interesting is that since the vote for Brexit, UKIP has collapsed. So if, in fact, what we were looking at was a kind of rise of a kind of xenophobic, you know, racist party, you could be thriving. But they're not, are they? They've collapsed because they delivered on the referendum. A very important thing, which some people are referring to, and I think it's very important, is that it says, it makes this point about EU citizens. I've said about British citizens. And it says about Theresa May getting it wrong again. It says here, every Brexit campaigner and all her rival candidates in the Tory leadership wanted to grant immediate and unconditional guarantees that EU citizens could stay. And everyone I know voted Brexit. Everyone of all sorts of political hues thinks that. And Theresa May won't guarantee it. Now, the reason I'm saying that is, again, this is a misreading, right?
But
and it's
not,
a disgrace.
That's because that's one of the few things that she's got, one of the few things that cards up her sleeve. And the Brits who live abroad also need to have their rights guaranteed.
But I'm seriously saying this is used by all sorts of people. Everyone I know who voted Brexit is worth the risk. We'll lose that guarantee. So I'm a big pro-Brexit person. I think I'd rather guarantee them and be honourable.
And show a goodwill gesture.
Yeah, but it's not just goodwill, it's because they've lived here, and you're basically saying we weren't voting to leave the EU to punish people who are living here now.
But I think what Fraser Nelson, and it is an excellent article, makes clear here is that the reality of the situation, the misreading from Mrs May, gives the perception that we are a hostile nation to immigration. Whether that's true or not, I don't believe it is true. I don't think Claire does either. But we've given the perception, as he says, if you're a Czech nurse wondering whether or not you're going to be allowed to stay here after Brexit, if you're one of the Windrush community waiting for a knock on the door, we are giving, at the highest level, the impression that we are hostile to immigrants.
But which is why I think people have got to stop saying that some of your peers in the Remain camp have got to stop saying that the Brexit vote was xenophobic and racist, because I think that's true. I mean, if you go around saying this meant this when it didn't, then that's how you frighten and scaremonger people. And
I accept that completely.
So I think that's where we've all got to back off.
And to go back to Windrush, obviously, there's the hotline where you can call in and suggest there are issues with you, but you still have to self-register. You have to be found yourself. Should they be, because there are no records for the Home Office to look through? So this is the difficulty, isn't it? The burden of proof lies with the individual who's having the grievance.
Yeah, I mean, they've got themselves into a technocratic mess. They both dealt with it technocratically and then badly. I mean, I think the idea that it's part of its data protection, we're only protecting your privacy, so we destroyed your records, that's what they originally said. You do think, what a feeble one that is.
I've seen on the internet loads of data, photocopies of landing records, of people coming in on the Windrush ship itself.
As to what you... I mean, because what they're saying is you've got...
Yeah,
but show humanity. But obviously, I'm not suggesting you just say, somebody turns up and says, hello, I am. You just go, all right, tick.
Yeah, but people have been showing their school records and still being rejected.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Show discretion and judgment. Technocratic, bureaucratic lunacy is where you sit there and go, well, I've seen all your school records since you were 10, but I haven't got the correct form, and therefore I don't believe you.
But this is Claire, I'm not sure I completely buy into that, because I think that feeds into the Amber Rudd's mitigation, that this is a sort of bureaucratic approach to a challenge. I think quite clearly it is in the policy that's been set, this hostile policy that is driving this. And the policy is deport first, appeal later. That's what these guys have...
I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying that in order to resolve it, you don't have to overdevelop a new scheme.